Ladies and gentlemen, the title for our next session is What's Liberal About Liberal Arts? And the key speakers for this session are Framji, Minwalla and Aqsa Ijaz. Moderator for this session is Aliya Iqbal-Naqvi. She is the faculty of history at the Department of Social Sciences and Liberal Arts, IBA Karachi, and a PhD candidate at Howard University in the history and culture of Islamic world. She was previously coordinator of the liberal arts program at the Indus Valley School of Arts and Architecture. Her research interests are the areas of history of ideas and transmission of knowledge. Aliya also serves as trustee of the Education Trust Nasra Schools. Over to Aliya.
Thank you. On my left is Aqsa Ijaz, a Lahore-based author and translator, formerly a junior fellow at the American Institute of Pakistan Studies, University of North Carolina. She has taught English literature and translation studies at Government College University, Lahore, and has been associated with Beacon House National University's Department of Liberal Arts since 2013. She is currently annotating her English translation of Mirza Athar Beg's Ghulam Bagh, along with the first English translation of Beg's short stories. She's presented her research extensively in the US and Europe on contemporary Urdu literature and Pakistani literature in general. Aqsa is also a vocalist whose songs include the Sufi poetry of classical Persian poets Rumi and Hafiz, and she is a regular contributor to the Express Tribune's op-ed and book review pages. To my right is Dr. Framji Minwalla, currently the chair of the Department of Social Sciences and Liberal Arts at the Institute of Business Administration, Karachi. He has taught at numerous institutions, including Yale University, Vassar College, Dartmouth College, George Washington University, New York University, Fordham University, and Zabist in Karachi. His research interests include performance literature and history, visual and cultural studies, theater and politics, media and film, and all forms of theory. Dr. Minwalla is also something of a guru of liberal arts curricular development in Pakistan. He set up the Media Sciences program at Zabist and the Liberal Arts department at IBA. So I'm going to start by asking Dr. Minwalla to frame the question, what's liberal about the liberal arts and what the liberal arts are for him.
Hi, good afternoon. So I'm a product of a liberal arts education. I went to a university in the US, and my understanding of education is very much grounded in the liberal arts tradition. Many people think of the liberal arts as primarily a collection of courses and a collection of courses related to the arts and the humanities. But that could not be further from the truth. When we talk about the liberal arts is actually a shorthand for liberal arts and sciences, where the liberal is a qualifier for both arts and sciences. And the focus of a liberal arts education or liberal arts and sciences education is actually exactly the opposite of the focus of perhaps what we would consider professional degree programs, the ones that prevail in Pakistan. So a BBA, for example, is not a liberal arts and sciences degree, would not constitute a liberal arts and sciences degree. A degree in engineering, electrical engineering, would not constitute a liberal arts and sciences degree. Essentially, what the liberal arts and sciences, the focus of the kind of education you receive is more focused on developing what many people would refer to as soft skills, but what I would refer to in a sense as essential skills. Thinking skills, critical thinking skills, creative problem solving skills, the ability to approach an issue or a question or a problem from multiple perspectives, to be able to see it from all sides, or rather from 360 degrees, in order to actually understand and then arrive at a complex understanding of the issue and a complex solution to the issue, critical reading skills, which are crucial in our time, the ability to read something, understand it, and respond to it in a complex, nuanced way as opposed to a knee-jerk, intuitive way. A liberal arts and science education is designed to develop, in many ways, at the heart of it, is to develop thoughtful citizens in a democracy. And I can talk a little bit more about that. Is that a fair definition? Yeah. So one of the things I've been doing in Pakistan since I came back, which was 6 years ago, is actually promoting exactly this, promoting the virtue and the value of a liberal arts and sciences undergraduate education so that students receive a broad-based understanding of the world in which we live and are able to apply that broad-based understanding to the lives that they will eventually live. It is not a training in job skills, and in many ways most of the undergraduate education in Pakistan has focused on or has moved towards a training in specific kinds of skills that one will use in a work setting, essentially. And that is really exactly what the liberal arts education, liberal arts and sciences education, I have to keep reminding myself also to keep saying that, is not about.
Aqsa.
Well, thank you so much for your very well-framed definition of liberal arts. But unfortunately, what is happening in the public universities in Pakistan, especially I'm speaking on Lahore University's perspective, that liberal arts is not really understood in terms of enabling a student for a critical process, critical thinking. So basically, not to introduce him or her to the idea of thinking and making his or her way through thinking, but sort of reading what is so fashionable and in vogue. For example, what I have experienced so far in terms of my experience in teaching liberal arts is that you just read literature because it's fancy in a university to read a literature, whereas you have no understanding of why you are enrolling in a certain subject, right? So my idea or an ideal should be to sort of provide a student with the rationale of why they have to go through that core process of studying liberal arts education, to begin with what is liberal about this very art, right? So I see a very sad division or sad divorce between an engineering student, for example, and a humanities student. And engineering students or medical students, they, for example, believe that the idea of studying literature is preposterous because it's like wasting time. They do not realize how important it is to put yourself into the other person's shoes to be able to empathize, and how important it is to think critically, even if you're an engineer or an architect. So this has been my sort of philosophy of teaching liberal arts up till now, and I hope it gradually furthers itself in its scope.
I mean, the world is changing so fast. We don't even know what tomorrow's jobs will be. Pure, utilitarian, professional degrees are, I mean, I'm going to go a step further and say are actually becoming obsolete without a liberal arts worldview or core. I'm just going to share with you something I found interesting. It's a recently conducted national survey of what employers want at global concerns in the US. And this is what they're looking for. 93% of global employers in the US felt, quote, that they wanted an undergraduate who demonstrated capacity to think critically, communicate clearly, and solve complex problems, which for them was more important than the undergraduate major. They wanted to hire students who demonstrated ethical judgment and integrity, intercultural skills, and the capacity for continued learning. I think that's one of the most important aspects of liberal arts education that we haven't emphasized enough. Because it's about habits of mind, because it's about learning skills, it's also about learning how to teach yourself. And that skill stays with you through life, through changing circumstances. So a student with an undergraduate degree in liberal arts is the most adaptable in a professional environment.
There was a recent study about the number of times individuals move jobs within their lifetime. And what these studies have been discovering is that, in fact, whereas 50 years ago, perhaps an individual would move through in their lifetime 2 or 3 workplaces, places of employment. My generation, the average is between 5 to 7 different jobs over the course of that. And we're not talking about actual different jobs in different, in the same area of expertise, but actually different jobs. And I can attest to that. I've actually worked in 6 very different places, most of them not mentioned in that bio, doing 6 very different things that required a completely different skill set for each one of those jobs. The estimated number of jobs that this current graduating generation will go through is anywhere between 12 and 15 over the course of their lifetimes. That the mobility from workplace to workplace and area of expertise to area of expertise is increasingly part of our employment landscape. And part of what a student needs to be able to learn in order to adapt to that kind of environment is the ability to learn on the job. It doesn't really matter what they have learned in school, it's the ability to learn in the workplace environment. I mean, in terms of job skills, what they've learned in school, not what they've learned in school in terms of thinking skills, obviously. That said, the other part of this is that, in a sense, many people seem to have this mistaken assumption that the liberal arts and sciences and the subjects taught in the liberal arts and sciences are focused on a particular kind of content. Right, so when you study literature, you're studying the content of literature. When you're studying history, you're studying the content of history. And when you're studying biology, you're studying the content of biology. And fundamentally, that is actually not the case. That the focus of courses in an undergraduate liberal arts and sciences education is not necessarily on the content, even though you need a specific content in order to teach what those courses teach. And that's the complicated negotiation that faculty have to do relative to how they teach their courses. The focus of those courses is really on a method. It's on a method of approach, a method of analysis, a method of thinking, a method of research, a method of writing. Each one of these disciplinary fields has a vocabulary and a language of its own. One of the things that students have to do is learn what that language is. So, for example, if you're studying biology or chemistry or physics or even mechanical engineering for that matter, if you do not understand what the scientific method is and how the scientific method operates as a way of thinking, as a mode of thought, that is very difficult to actually get a more complex understanding of the field within which you are either studying or working, right? The scientific method specifically calls for a kind of experimentation and a kind of evidence gathering and a kind of material support for the theories and the hypotheses that one puts forward through empirical observation in the world around us. And to learn that is a complex process. And part of what a liberal arts sciences education teaches you is exactly that, how to think in that way. And an understanding of history, one of the things that you have to learn if you're a historian or if you're studying history is, in fact, how history moves, what history is in the process of moving from, say, one particular time period to another. How do historical transitions happen? It's not necessarily how did we move from, say, 1946 to 1947 and from British India into an independent Pakistan, but really what the process of change is, how that change happened, and how that change might be different relative to, say, the change that happened in Algeria, or in Argentina, or in Brazil, or in the Philippines. And that comparative approach to a kind of historiographical understanding of the processes of decolonization colonization, that's a very long sentence, that if you understand that in a complex way, you have a better chance of being able to look at the world around you and assess and evaluate the kinds of transitional changes that are happening in our world, the world that we inhabit, right? So in a sense, one of the things that history teaches you to do, or teaches a student to do, is to look even at our present moment as if it were historical, and to understand our present moment as one moment in a continuous process of change. Because if the one thing that we all know is the one thing that we all really embrace, well, we don't embrace it necessarily, but we all know is that the one constant in our lives is change. And to understand change in a complex way is one of the ways in which we ourselves as individuals can adapt to and adopt and embrace the changes that happen and work with them in productive as opposed to debilitating ways, right? So part of a liberal arts and sciences education is a training of the mind in order for us to know ourselves and the way we ourselves function in the larger world around us. And all of these subjects, all of the disciplinary areas of study are designed to teach a student different methods of approach so that we can understand that in all of its nuanced ways. Yeah.
Well, I have a sort of a question. And you see, in my brief experience of teaching and being a student in Pakistan throughout my life, the question is like, what you're talking about is a very complex process of being in the life of the mind and going through the thinking process, which probably an average Pakistani student doesn't get to have, right? So let's say from the high school education that an average Pakistani gets, people who are not doing O-levels and A-levels, and they eventually get into the universities, they don't seem to have this rigorous intellectual passion that they would want to engage with so many things at one time simultaneously. So in your experience, and since you design courses in liberal arts and all that, I mean, we are just trying a little bit to sort of do an interdisciplinary effort. Do you think it's so given that, you know, you have all this map in your mind that a student could engage in a dialogue with these disciplines and then also be very clear about what he or she is doing?
I'm going to let you take it, but first...
No, you should take it.
Yeah.
We'll both take it. It's a very important thing that you've pointed out. And whether they're coming from A-levels or from inter, all Pakistani students come unprepared for this, which is fine. It's not necessarily a terrible thing, because the undergraduate liberal arts experience and the undergraduate college experience in general on the liberal arts model is about creating 3 or 4 years of protected time at a crucial juncture in a human being's growth and development, where they learn to do these things, where they learn, you know, it's like 4 years of intellectual training. It's like being in a gym. Right? You build an intellectual muscle rather than hoard content and information. That's the difference.
Yeah, so you mentioned another word which I think is becoming increasingly crucial in a liberal arts context, and that is interdisciplinarity and the coming together of disciplines in complicated ways. So one of the there has been a series of recent developments both in cognitive studies in psychology and in the study of literature in the humanities. And the coming together of these two disciplines, as an example, is, I think, suggestive of, in fact, exactly what a liberal arts and sciences education accomplishes. So there is now an entire field of literary studies called cognitive literary studies. And what cognitive literary studies attempts to do is to assess exactly what happens to the mind and the way in which one thinks while we read. So what happens to us and what happens to the way our minds work in psychological terms while we are in the process of reading, not what happens to our minds after we finish reading. And I think this is also crucial to why we have literature festivals and why we celebrate literature in the first place. So there were a number of psychologists who actually have been experimenting experimenting and working with these ideas. And they have developed what is called a theory of mind. A theory of mind actually is a theory that, and it's a theory because it remains unproven, though psychologists have a significant body of evidence now and are moving towards a proof of a theory of mind. And it is the ability of an individual to acknowledge and understand that other people in the world exist and they think differently than the individual thinks, right? And we all know that this is true, but there's no proof to assess how we know it. One of the things that psychologists have discovered is that for those individuals who read literature, and when they define literature in very particular ways, as opposed to nonfiction or newspapers or popular fiction. So popular fiction, the kinds of romance novels that one would pick up at the supermarket, and certain kinds of more genre fiction would be considered popular fiction. Science fiction is considered popular fiction. Though, of course, even in genre fiction, there are literary forms of those genres, yes? And what they have discovered that for individuals who read literature and read literature with a degree of regularity, their capacity for a theory of mind, the ability to acknowledge that other opinions exist and that they are equally valid as opposed to thinking that everybody should think and behave and act in exactly the same way that you do, right, that one individual does, is directly related to that activity, the reading of literature. Now, this is the coming together of two completely different disciplines in a really interesting and complicated way in order to assess a process, right? So the other part of, that liberal arts and sciences education teaches a method, it also teaches a process. And the process is a process of actually learning. And one of the things that psychologists and of course this is something English teachers have known for a very long time, and psychologists are just waking up to it perhaps, and forgive me if there are psychologists in the audience.
Can I also ask you to talk about not literary fiction, but poetry?
Yes.
What poetry does to the mind?
And poetry actually is perhaps one of the most difficult and the most complicated in the way that the mind responds to it. So, for many teachers actually teach poetry by asking students to memorize poems. And I think actually that is a brilliant thing to do. That in fact, when I teach literature, I actually require my students to memorize at least one poem over the course of the semester and to be able to recite it in front of the class by heart. The process of memorizing poems are difficult. Poems are difficult for everybody, and they're difficult for everybody because the language in a poem is compact, and the structure of a poem actually asks you to think of something relative to some other thing, which is really the function of simile and metaphor, right? A metaphor is fundamentally the saying of something in the language of some other thing. Quote something you want to quote. Actually the one I was teaching last week, so I'll quote that. Some say the world will end in fire, others say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I know of the. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if it had to perish twice, I say that for destruction, ice is also great and would suffice. Now, I mean, that's one of the more simpler, it's somewhat simpler, but Frost is not talking about climate change. He's not talking about fire and ice in those literal ways. He's talking about something else, and he's talking about something else without specifying what that something else is, though there are hints, I think, in the poem itself that leads one in one direction or another direction. Part of the complication of poetry is that it means on multiple levels and it means in multiple directions simultaneously. And if anybody who reads Ghalib or Fez or Frost or Shakespeare understands this, right? But for students, this is a very difficult idea, that in fact one thing can mean many things.
And that is probably the very thing, the very tool to enable students to interpret in multiple ways. So the interpretation is
so
what
close
is desired.
reading of a complicated literary text with whether it's poetry or fiction, but poetry more so, actually, more than anything else, teaches you those critical abilities that you take to any situation and discipline. So when you learn to unpack the multiple meanings in a metaphor, when you learn to ask questions about why is the poet using this image here, why did the character make such a decision, reflective close reading, then you are able to take those skills to any decision-making or problem-solving process in the sciences or your professional life.
And that's also the idea, you know, like cosmologists these days are propounding the theories of inflationary universe, right? So they believe that the idea of universe is not a singular one. This is not the only universe that we inhabit. But there are multiple universes, the microcosms of various universes that we may inhabit. So the idea is that it might be argued that all the literary works that we read, for example, novel comes very close to the definition of being a world. So the phenomenological process of reading and going through that process of a story and, as you say, the character's decision and the dialogue and how the sort of narratological point of view, how it is being narrated from a cognitive point of view, makes you a questioner that is not really readily given to our student in a traditional way of teaching literature, for example.
But, you know, I said this in Karachi, and I said this actually at the end of the panel last time, but, you know, one of the things that if you drive a car in Karachi, or if you have ever driven a car in Karachi, one of the things that you recognize immediately, that the majority of the people driving on the road believe that nobody else on the road exists. I mean, really fundamentally, and so they will stop wherever they want, they will, they turn, you know, and part of it is this incapacity to understand that, in fact, when one is in a public environment, engaged in a public activity, that one has to acknowledge that there are also other individuals engaged in a similar kind of activity. It's about actually developing a civic sense. And a civic sense for us has to be an acknowledgement that other people exist, that they also have agendas and desires and needs, and they are also on timetables, and that, you know, if you drive your car in a particular way in order to create more traffic jams as opposed to less traffic jams, right? You are simply refusing to acknowledge that you are behaving as if your issue and your need and your agenda is paramount and nobody else's. And I think one of the central problems that we face in Pakistan is exactly this problem, this refusal to accommodate other people and the refusal to accommodate their agendas or their needs. And I know it's perhaps a very large thing to say, but I think the majority of people who do that do not read literature. They really don't. And they do not allow the work of reading to give them a sense of a larger world outside of them, and to give them an understanding that multiple plural perspectives exist, and that plurality of perspectives all have a degree of legitimacy, right? Even if those disagree with your most cherished beliefs or your most closely held ideas.
Can I ask you to read that wonderful excerpt on this that you had chosen?
Which one?
On civic responsibility.
Yeah. So this is a collection of essays written by Bartlett Giamatti. Bartlett Giamatti was the president of Yale University, and after retiring as president from Yale University, he was the commissioner of baseball in the United States, and for many people that was the more important position. He was also a Renaissance scholar, and he was a scholar of Edmund Spenser's poetry. So Yale University made its president for a significant amount of time, right? Somebody who studied, and his scholarship was focused on Edmund Spenser and Edmund Spenser's Shepherd's Calendar, which is a pastoral cycle of poetry, and The Faerie Queene, which is perhaps one of the greatest poems written in early Renaissance England. So this is what he says. A free society must not wish to over-control the very process by which its young learn how valuable and irreplaceable its freedoms of merit, competing of choice and belief and speech, how irreplaceable these are. The process by which those values and others are learned is the educational process, and that process has a deep and abiding purpose, which government shares and should not wish to deter, namely the shaping of citizens. I say that because I believe that the formation of a basis for how we choose to believe and speak and treat others, how, in short, we choose a civic role for ourselves, is the basic purpose of an education in a democracy. The content, the data, the information of schooling can be anything in the wide world, but the purpose of education, as opposed to information, is to lead us to some sense of citizenship, to some shared assumptions about individual freedoms and institutional needs, to some sense of the full claims of self as they are to be shared with others. For some, I may have a much too old-fashioned sense of the civic claims of education and an insufficient regard for the social claims. But I would argue that without an ethically based civic sense, nourished in an individual through education, larger social claims issue merely into programs for action with no controlling perspective about what the action is for. So essentially he's arguing that without a really strongly honed and grounded ethical sense, and an ethical sense that acknowledges civic purpose, right? Whatever one chooses to do in the social world, whatever civic action one chooses to engage, right, really has no grounding in terms of judgment. How do you judge whether the thing you want to do is a good thing or a bad thing, will lead to a positive result for everybody, to a public good, or to a public bad, right? Action without a deeper purpose is useless. It is only activity, and that is always finally susceptible to the sweet, solipsistic allure of anarchy. I really like that phrase. Historically, education has been the best stay against such confusion by fostering the civilizing ability to make choices and to act responsibly for others on the basis of those choices. And notice he says, act responsibly for others on the basis of those choices, right? And that's really, at the heart of it, that is what a liberal arts and sciences education teaches. And in the world today, when we think about liberal arts and sciences, we think about the U.S. and the U.S. undergraduate model. But increasingly, there is a reason that it has lasted so long and that it has endured for so long. Over the last 20 years, the liberal arts and sciences undergraduate education in the U.S. has come under increasing pressure to change, and many colleges, many universities have begun to actually succumb to that pressure. Meanwhile, in educational systems in England, in Europe, in Germany, and in France, Germany not so much, France yes, Spain yes, but across Asia, in Australia, educational undergraduate systems that function primarily or focus primarily in professional areas of teaching and investigation are all shifting very gradually, but they're all shifting towards the liberal arts and sciences model. Partly because of the endurance and the success of the US model, I think, but also a recognition that in fact what the things that they were teaching their students, their undergraduate students, at that most impressionable of ages, 19 to 22, 23, right, was crucial in developing a population, a citizenry that was informed, that had a civic understanding of their responsibility, as well as a civic understanding of the rights accorded to them as citizens in a democratic society. And as much as we do not exist in a democratic society in Pakistan, we are aspiring to be a democratic nation. And perhaps, part of my argument to people in Pakistan is that, well, perhaps one of the only ways that we will get there eventually, not this generation, maybe not even the next generation, but the generation after, is if we institute structures of education and to do it in a systematic way across the board so that students can develop these sensibilities and these perspectives. So.
Any last thoughts, Aqsa? I thought we'd open up the conversation if people have questions.
We have 20 or more minutes.
That's all right.
Yeah, questions?
Let's bring the audience in. Do you have mics or no?
This is a very interesting discussion, but it set me thinking, and I'll put to you what thoughts came to me. See, there's nothing liberal about liberal arts, because liberal is an ideological, political term. Education is education. I have done both. I have done my initial education in liberal arts, getting a master's in literature, and then I have done international public policy in my specialized subject. So I think it's an anachronism. It's historical. It is not qualitative or categorization wise a term. So any comments on that? Thank you.
So actually it's even worse than that, right? So the liberal in liberal arts and sciences were designated, initially when the phrase itself was used, it designated an education for free men in the United States. So so essentially it ignored an entire, significant portions of the US population and free leisured men, right? So this is the education that was given to the children of the wealthy. But the reason it was given to the children of the wealthy was because the children of the wealthy, it was assumed, would take over the reins of the country. And that by taking over the reins of the country, that they would be more civic-minded. Now, of course, if you look at US history, that of course did not necessarily happen. But in a sense, part of the way in which liberal is used today is somewhat different than that. So when people talk about a liberal arts and sciences education today in the US, they mean multiple things by liberal, and it's not just about a designation for who should be educated. One of the things is, in fact, that education should be available to all, and that the liberality of that education should extend to all corners of the population, to all people who are members of that society. That's one part of it. The other part of it is that the liberal in academic contexts should imply the free exercise of intellectual ability relative to any subject that one might want to explore, right? So a complete degree of academic freedom without any curtailment of that freedom relative to the controversial nature or the taboo nature of a particular subject area. The third part of it, I think, and I think it's also crucial in the context of this kind of education, is the developing of a flexible enough curriculum to give students the ability to choose their own education, and that which means that the responsibility of the education itself rests firmly on the shoulders of a student, as opposed to on the shoulders of an administration or a faculty who are telling students, you have to take this, and you have to take this, and you have to take this, right? If you look at the HEC's curricular model, fully 2/3 of the courses that students take at an undergraduate institution are required courses, and 1/3 of those courses are flexible in terms of student choice, but flexible in terms of student choice in very limited and narrow ways, actually. Whereas if anybody has been to a U.S. undergraduate institution, they give you this book, and the book is this thick, and it has hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of courses, and you are completely at sea. You have no idea what you have to do or what to choose, and they give you some parameters and some structures, and they give you an advisor, and they say, go for it. And essentially that's what students end up doing, and I think part of the liberal arts education today is about that. So I think, yes, and absolutely you're right, that there is a politics involved here, and a politics at the heart of liberalism that is central to these notions. But that is a very complicated conversation about the development of liberalism as a U.S. political ideology, and its restructuring today as a kind of neoliberal ideology in the 21st century. So, but yes.
Right. Actually, I want to add to what you said and what was said earlier. In Europe, the term liberal art was a very precise thing. It was when the church, especially the Church of England, it stopped imposing theology. It was then that subjects could be studied without reference to theology and the Bible. And the term liberal, therefore, referred to that movement initially. One part. The rest, what you said, is absolutely true, but that's in the US. The second thing, which is still there in many British universities, Oxford and Cambridge especially, is that students are actually free, much more free even now, to choose subjects than the US has. Now, this was not called liberal. This was simply assumed that because they are grown up after BA, they are choose, and within BA also, they are free to choose, etc., and they would be able to, attend some lectures or even not attend lectures. Even now in Oxford, you don't have to attend a professor's lecture. You have to go to the tutor. So that initially the term meant freedom from the teachings of the Church of England, and in Europe, freedom from the Catholic Church teaching and freedom from the Orthodox Church teaching in some parts. That was what it was. So, studies without religion determining everything, that is the essence of liberalism. Thank you very much.
So you see, according to this historical context of liberal arts, which also included the terms like trivium, the Latin word for 3 parts, which included rhetoric, grammar, and logic. And the 4 parts, the quadrivium, included music, astronomy, geometry, and arithmetic. So that is what constituted the liberal arts subjects, which were not to be mastered only, but to constitute the soul of a society, right? Which would entail wisdom, right? And the ultimate love of wisdom, which they termed philosophy in classical thing. So since it's a liberation from a religious way of thinking, since every university in the West was supposedly a university under the church, so how do you place the module in Pakistani context? So you see, unlike many other disciplines that we have here, it also seems somewhat imported without knowing the ground realities or without probably engaging with the realities as they are here locally. So that's my question.
I think there's a degree of anxiety that students and parents have, and that degree of anxiety really has to do with employment and self-sustenance beyond a certain age. I think that's part of it, and I think that anxiety overwhelms individuals and parents, and that's part of it. The other part of it, I think, is the amount of money spent on an education. And for parents especially, if they're spending that kind of money, they want to make sure that by the time that their children emerge from school, that they will be employable, that they will be able to get jobs. And the only way, well, not the only way, but in many ways, education has been structured, to satisfy that demand, to satisfy that impulse for parents, and increasingly for students as well. At IBA in Karachi, which is probably the strangest place to imagine a liberal arts and sciences undergraduate education, we have a department now. And the department is 3 years old. And we have managed to attract, in those 3 years, we have a student body of 249 students right now. Many of those students actually have been transferring out of the other programs at IBA into our program. This spring, we were not actually supposed to have any new admissions. We actually ended up having 22, all of which were transfers from other departments within IBA. Part of what even students are beginning to recognize is the value of this education. One of the things that Dr. Ishrat Hussain did, which I think was quite remarkable in the context of IBA, was insist that for every other department, that students from those other departments were required to take anywhere between 4 and 8 courses in the Department of Social Sciences and Liberal Arts. So computer science students, economics students, math students, business students, accounting and finance students are all now required to take between 4 and 8 courses, beyond those courses in English composition and speech and Pakistan history, which is required, of course, for everybody. And the remarkable difference is that, in fact, these students are bringing that knowledge and that understanding and that training in a particular kind of methodological approach to their subjects back to their own departments. And what the faculty are beginning to tell us is that there is a difference, that they are beginning to see slight shifts, not major shifts, but slight shifts in the way that students begin to approach, say, even the study of computer sciences or the study of accounting and finance, though less so with accounting and finance, more so with computer sciences. And I'm not exactly sure why. But it has been an incredible experiment for IBA and a huge challenge for us, the faculty who teach there. Aliya is one of them. But what we are discovering is that it's incredibly satisfying, and there is an entire large student population out there who have been craving programs like this in Pakistan and who have not had access to them. Okay? One of our students actually, so should I boast about our students? He's actually not one of our students. He's actually a student of business. He has his degree in BBA actually. He just graduated last year. He also works for Oxford University Press right now. His entire goal has been over the 4 years at IBA not to study business. He has been wanting to study everything else possible. So we gave him special permission to take more than 8 courses in the social sciences. He ended up taking, I think, 11 or 12. This past year, just now actually, he got a full scholarship to the Divinity School at Harvard to study what is it? A master's in comparative theology. But it's those kinds of success stories, and those are fewer, but they seem to be fewer and far between now, but I don't think they will remain so. The other university that has set this up in Karachi, of course, is Habib. Habib is in the process of developing, they've developed, a liberal core, and now they are integrating that liberal core into all of their programs. Habib University, the oldest liberal arts college in Pakistan, is in Lahore. It's not the one you teach at, actually. So the oldest college in Lahore that calls itself a liberal arts and sciences college is Foreman Christian. FC, yeah. So it is there. It just needs to be taken advantage of it. Now I need some fun.
All right. I would like to say that I have thoroughly, right here in the front. Yes, I would like to say that I've thoroughly enjoyed this discussion, especially somebody who's coming from Generation Y. The issue is that our nation has bred generations and generations of drones that have been taught to be either doctors or engineers or at most MBAs. The issue is that liberal arts has really not been very popular among the older generation. As Framji already mentioned, they want their kids to secure employment as soon as possible. So the question is, how do you see or how do you ensure that they see the importance of liberal education so that it grows in the generations to come?
Well, that's where we started, right? That increasingly the utilitarian concept of knowledge-based professional education is just not enough. You will not be or excel as a doctor or a business professional if that's the only education you have. If you don't also have a liberal arts and sciences education, then you will not have that extra skill set to come out on top. So that's our utilitarian response for your parents. But it's there, and that's why I actually read out the findings of the employer survey to you earlier, where 93% of global employers based in the US said they preferred undergraduates with the ability to think broadly and critically, rather than people with BBAs.
Aliya, that also seems to be a little irony. You know, now you see that in US they are on the verge of shutting down most humanities department in many universities, right? And liberal arts education is probably the least funded education now. Government doesn't spend much for the liberal arts education. Literature majors are probably the only ones who don't get to have a scholarship and to study the graduate levels and all that. So, and also to answer her question, to extend on what you have said, liberal arts is not very old here. You know, it's just probably in last 5 years that we have witnessed.
In that way.
In that way. Yeah. So I think to communicate it to a generation before you is probably the task of the discipline and its graduates, and so that they could sort of, somewhat communicate the idea of liberal arts education success along with the education that they are getting as engineering majors or whatever.
I have a question. We, in our child rearing practices and in our schooling, primary, secondary, and higher, teach what to think and not how to think. And the fact is that education becomes the greatest obstacle to learning. And ultimately, we do not find much difference between students of liberal arts and liberal sciences as far as critical thinking is concerned. As adults, we lack the cognitive structures necessary to think critically. We do not think critically. We as a nation lack the ability to think critically. Your comments on that?
Yeah, I agree with you completely. One of my cousins actually runs a school in Karachi, and he told me once that the only actual teaching that he or his colleagues get done at that school is between class 6 and 8. So he has them for 2 years, 6 and 7, class 6 and 7, where some really focused work on developing critical thinking skills can happen. Because by the time he gets to class 8, they are only teaching to the O level, and then they are only teaching to the A level. So they're teaching in some ways, the focus of the teaching is test taking, how to take that test, how to write that answer, how to formulate an essay, how to approach the solving of those math problems, those questions. Part of, I think, the problem has become this obsessive need for quantitative data in terms of assessment. That we need to assess students in these particular ways, and we need to assess them objectively, and that the only form of objective assessment happens in an examination context, and the examination itself then serves as the end of whatever teaching that gets done in the secondary school. But this is increasingly so at the college, university level as well. One of the arguments that I constantly have with my colleagues is, in fact, examinations are far from an objective measure of assessment, that there are very few objective measures of assessment in the context of education, that education is not an efficient process, learning is not an efficient process, and the more you try to make learning efficient, the more you are undermining the process through which learning actually happens. And I think this is part of the problem. Yeah.
Can I ask a question? I would like to add to your issue. You said that there was a change in the teaching methods, but I'd like to tell you that in Japan recently, all the top universities have given up liberal arts. It's been banned by the parliament. You'd be surprised to know about that. That is strange. I mean, technical knowledge is all that they want, it seems. And I would like to add to this gentleman's point that the problem with us, I belong to the Council of Social Sciences. We are trying to promote research. We are often asked, why is there no research mind in the people here? That is a very important issue. The problem is that you are not taught to be critical from the very beginning in education. As a child, you're not told to criticize or look at alternative issues. So it's so important to develop this mind, critical mind, just from childhood. That's how it works. And you cannot do research in graduates or postgraduates unless you have that critical mind in.
That, I think everybody would agree with that, but just to play devil's advocate, and Framji and I and Aqsa, we're all teaching undergraduates today, people in their, 18 to 22 age group. And I have to say that even though they're coming out of such a schooling system and homes where you're not encouraged to ask questions necessarily, they are so open to it. It takes you a few weeks to just get them to literally unfurl. So there's something I think about that, the age that they are at, perhaps, that allows for that. And they're hungry,
The aspiration is there, you know, you can't say that if you provide them the opportunity and they deny it, they don't want to deny that. So we teach things like, you know, Jafar Thade Sari's Kala Pani, and this is something not many elders know about, you know, that about this jihadi's transformation into the world of knowledge, into the world of literature. And when we teach these kind of things, or Mirza Athar Beg's Ghulam Bagh, which is accused of being, you know, exorbitantly philosophical and this and that, but people respond to it, children respond to it. And they produce things, they produce research or critical pieces, which is unprecedented in my experience of being a student here.
Thank you. Actually, a lot of the parts of my questions have already been asked and answered partially. I would just like to then pick on a statement made by Framji that maybe not in the next or the next generation, but 3 years, generations down the line, he assumes that, such a change will take place in Pakistan. Given the fact that mainstream, you did mention some schools and your own school where there were children coming from, the mainstream schools and then yet being open to being, sort of critical thinking, etc. But what makes you think that there are the policies of the government or even HSE for that matter, I have some experience with them, or for instance the scholarships that are offered to Pakistan through HSE. I know the case of France, which only gives scholarships for engineering or medical sciences. And if it continues to be profession oriented, and there is a dire need in our society for sort of critical thinking and going back, and I agree with you that it isn't something that is new, but it is something that had been shut off from the rich cultural heritage and critical thinking and literature and so many other fields of liberal arts that we excelled in this part of the world. So what makes you think that given the situation as it is and then the forces at work right now, what makes you think that 3 generations down the line we will come through?
I am eternally hopeful, maybe. Yeah.
पाकिस्तान की एक बहुत बड़ी खूबी ये है कि सरकार हमारे जहनियत पे हावी नहीं है. We're a very post-nationalist society, and most good things that happen, the state has a very important role and it should play that role, but because it hasn't, most good things that happen have been civil society initiatives. Most of these schools we're talking about are private or run along the lines of private institutions. And it allows for a unique and unprecedented kind of intellectual freedom that even, our otherwise enviable neighbors don't have. That's why our media is so free, for instance. So I think that's where the hope is.
But I think, both these comments touch on something really very important. And I think part of the notion that a liberal has a particular ideology to it, all of these things, there are problems with the liberal arts and science and education. Nobody's saying there aren't. And those problems have to do with the actual restructuring or thinking of students in class terms, right? So who should get a liberal arts and science and education? Who should get a professional education? Of course, we need carpenters and plumbers and we need technical people. Otherwise, our daily lives would be miserable and none of us would know how to. But, it would help if some of us actually knew how to fix a tap or to, rewire a fuse or those kinds of things. It would help us as well as individuals, I think. But I think part of the direction in which this is moving, and this is getting back to the use of the word interdisciplinarity, is the bringing of a liberal arts and sciences sensibility into professional education, and to bringing of a sensibility relative to professional education into the liberal arts and sciences. And I think so, one of the ways in which this is happening is in fact what is happening at IBA, where in fact the professional degree programs, the students are required to take a certain number of courses that will develop their critical thinking skills, their communication skills, their civic skills, those kinds of things. It is not necessarily happening the other way around though. So students in liberal arts and sciences programs are not forced to learn how to actually do double column, double entry ledgers, or those, and those kinds of very specific skills that people need relative to a particular profession or vocation. And I think it does need to happen the other way as well. So I think, liberal arts and sciences education is at a moment of transition, I think, and it's a very interesting moment of transition I find it very interesting, and I think that this is a moment where Pakistani educational institutions can be creative about how this happens. And if we are creative about how this happens, the generations who come out of these institutions will be better equipped to actually function and take leadership roles in our society, and hopefully get us out of these, ridiculous quagmires and ruts that we seem to consistently fall back on, right? Yeah.
I think one of the things we've all mentioned but circled around, and I think it's a point that should be made on its own, is a lot of this comes down to how such an education is delivered by faculty. So it is really about the training, fostering, and encouragement of faculty, the right kind of faculty.
Thank you, Framji, Minwalla, Aqsa, Ijaz, and Aliya Iqbal-Naqvi for a wonderful session regarding the liberal arts.